Hi everyone, I am going to be reading you the next chapter of Secrets of a Sun King tonight. Chapter 7. I'd assumed we'd get cracking on our plan straight away, but in our excitement we'd forgotten it was the weekend. And that meant fewer trains, closed post offices and our parents at home an annoying amount of the time. We could do very little before Monday, which was hugely frustrating. "You're right, Lil," Mum kept asking all Friday night. Fine. But I was pretty useless at keeping secrets, and by Saturday morning I felt twitchier than ever. I'd also realised the flaw in our plan. Tulip and Oz were returning the jar to a tomb they didn't actually know the whereabouts of. I was pretty sure by now that it didn't come from Mr. Carter's dig. Returning it there to break the curse would be pointless. We'd be taking it from one archaeologist's hand and putting it straight into another's. The evidence pointed to it being somewhere in the Luxor area. But where exactly? What was needed was the rest of Professor Hinawati's translation, which hopefully might tell us where Kaikai was buried. I was already keen to read more about Lysandra and Maya and what happened to poor Kaikai in the end. The more I thought about it, the more pressing it became to get hold of the translation. Trouble was, it was very likely to be inside Professor Hinawati's house. "It's not exactly stealing," Tulip reassured me a few hours later, as we crossed the park in the middle of Russell Square. "More like collecting what he meant to send to your granddad." Directly after breakfast, I'd made excuses about needing a library book, then gone straight to Tulip and Oz's house. Luckily, Tulip had that morning received her pocket money, which covered our bus fares to Russell Square. Professor Hinawati's house was just around the corner. "But we've still got to get inside the building," I reminded her. "Knock on the door," Oz said, like we'd overlooked something obvious. "And say what exactly?" Because I knew I'd go completely tongue-tied. "I could pretend to be a relative," Tulip mused. "Though I'd be surprised if there's anyone at home." "In which case, can't I just crawl in through a window?" I said, which felt far more straightforward to me. "In broad daylight? In central London?" Tulip looked horrified. "Do you want to go to prison?" I got the sinking feeling that I'd not thought this through. At the edge of the park, we stopped. It was yet another bitterly cold, grey November day, and it made me wonder vaguely if feast days to the sun actually worked, and whether we should try it sometime. We huddled together for warmth, at least Tulip and I did. Oz stood apart, hands deep in his pockets. "Which house is his?" Tulip asked, scanning the rows of tall buildings surrounding us on all sides. "It's down that side street." I pointed to a turning on the right. The professor's address had been on the letter he'd sent Grandad. Number 10. It was obvious which house it was. A policeman had been stationed outside. Our chances of getting inside, already slim, now seemed about as likely as a heatwave in December. It wouldn't have occurred to me in a million years to approach the policeman. But Tulip was quite composed. "Let's see what we can find out from him." "Are you sure?" I asked warily. "Lil," she said, "trust me." I glanced at Oz, who did a funny half shrug. "All right." We headed down the side street. The policeman, when he saw us coming, rocked back on his heels. Straight away, Tulip took charge. "Can you help us, please? We're supposed to be visiting." Rummaging in her coat pocket, she pulled out a crumpled bit of paper. I was close enough to see it was a receipt from a bookshop, but, bold as brass, She pretended to read out an address. My uncle lives there. I'm in the right street, aren't I? He's expecting us, you see, I chipped in. Number 10? Your uncle? The policeman rubbed his chin. I worried she'd gone a bit far. But the policeman, taking in Tulip's dark complexion, was clearly of the opinion that if two people had brown skin, then they must be related. In short, he believed her. This might be a shock to you, the policeman said, but I'm afraid your uncle has passed away. Oh, my goodness! Tulip wiped her eyes. There might even have been real tears in them. She'd also, cunningly, kept moving closer to the house's front step. Is my aunt at home? She'd never forgive us if we didn't pay our respects. But the policeman was getting suspicious. The house is under investigation. You can't go in, he replied, beckoning us away from the door. So I'm afraid you'd best hop it, kiddies. He'd never have let you inside, Oz told Tulip once we were safely out of earshot. He probably hasn't even got a key. You still could have backed me up, she said crossly. Thanks for trying anyway, I told her. But we weren't getting any closer to getting our hands on the translation. I was feeling cold and rather fed up. At this rate, we'd have to wait until after dark to sneak inside the house, and by then our parents would be wondering where we were. I was mulling all this over when a coal merchant's horse and cart swung out into the street. It had come from an alleyway alongside the last house in the row. If, as I was thinking, it was the tradesman's entrance, the alley would run along the back of the whole terrace. It gave me an idea, which I quickly explained to the others. You're mad, Tulip said, though she didn't try and talk me out of it, which I took to be a good sign. When the policeman was looking the other way, we ducked down the alley. True enough, it ran along the back of all of the houses. The plan was for Tulip and Oz to stay near the entrance and keep watch. Don't be long, Tulip whispered. I'd once heard it said that thieves would spend hours watching a house they planned to rob, but we didn't have that luxury. I'll time you, Oz said, looking at his watch. 10 minutes. Go. I set off, aiming for the third house in the row. What I hoped to find was a little larder window left open, or a cellar door unlocked. I was nervous, and was sure it was looking obvious to everyone that I was up to no good. Almost immediately, a servant girl came out of the first house to throw potato peelings in a bin. She glared at me, hands on hips. You better not be one of those newspaper reporters sniffling around here again. She must have had terrible eyesight to mistake me for a grown-up. I've lost my dog. It was the first thing I could think of. Aye, that's what they all say, she sneered, but thankfully went back inside. By the time I got to the right house, I was sweating. I'd visions of the Hanawati's maid chasing after me with a broom, or their cook threatening me with a rolling pin. But the back of the place was completely shut up and silent. There were no lights on inside, no smoke coming from the chimney. Steps led to a basement, so, with a quick glance over my shoulder, I went down them and found the door at the bottom locked. Somewhere out in the lane, I heard another door slam and voices, a girl's and a man's, coming from the opposite end to where Tulip and Oz were keeping watch. She's down here somewhere, poking about, the girl said. I recognised her voice and groaned. It was the short-sighted servant again. You did the right thing coming to find me. Now, leave this in the hands of the law, the man reassured her. I gulped. The law? Drat and blast it. The stupid girl had only gone and fetched the policeman from round the front. Flustered, I tried the basement door again. It was still locked. No amount of rattling and pushing would change it. Nor was there any time to run. Already, I could see the top of the policeman's helmet as he approached the house next door. Desperately, I tried to think up an excuse for being here. The dog one obviously hadn't worked. When I saw the coal chute door, all thinking stopped. It was at head height next to the basement entrance, and metal. And more importantly, when I lifted the hatch, it was just about big enough. This was my way in. With a great heave and kick, I scrambled through the opening. The hatch swung shut behind me. The policeman must have thought I'd vanished into thin air. The chute part was short. I slid down it chin first and hit the ground with a whump. It was pretty dark down here and stank of damp and coal, though thankfully the floor was a soil one and soft, so I wasn't hurt. I scrambled to my feet. The door from the coal store led out onto a brick passage. Down one end was the kitchen. The only sound coming from it was that of a dripping tap. At the other end was a staircase that I guessed led to the ground floor. I sprang up the stairs. Though I could feel my heart beating strongly, I wasn't scared anymore. I'd done the hard bit. I'd got inside. All I had to do now was find the translation and crawl back up the coal chute. In the hallway, I hesitated. Where to look first? In his letter to Grandad, the professor had mentioned a study and working at a desk. The study was the first room I came to, though finding it wasn't down to luck. What got my attention was a terrible smell. On opening the door, the smell got 10 times worse, so bad in fact that I had to cover my mouth with my hand. It was worse than a meat locker in summer, worse than our outside lab when the drains blocked up. It was so bad I couldn't even put a name to it. The room itself felt strange too, the air prickly, as if someone had been in here only seconds ago. For the first time since coming into the house, I began to feel ill at ease. Though the shutters were closed at the windows, there was enough light to see by. Everything looked black and grey. At the centre of the room was a desk, smaller than Grandad's and definitely tidier. A blotter, a stack of notebooks and a letter rack were all lined up neatly down one side. A jacket had been slung across the chair like someone had just taken it off. It made me suddenly sad, that jacket. I tried very hard not to look at it, instead keeping my eyes peeled for any sign of Professor Hanawati's distinctive royal blue writing paper. A couple of steps to the left, and I realised I'd trodden in something horrid. In the gloom, I couldn't see what, but the soles of my shoes were sticking to it. Lifting my feet made a slurpy, wet sound, and the smell, if it was possible, got worse. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, only that it filled the whole room and made my stomach heave. Quickly now, I searched the professor's desk. There were no letters. The notebooks were mostly empty. The translation wasn't here either. I just hoped he hadn't hidden it somewhere unlikely. I didn't think my guts could stand this smell much longer. Next, I searched the bookshelves, shook out books, felt between them, nothing. Then, on a side table, I noticed a photograph in a silver frame. In the picture were two men. One I didn't recognise, with a dark, proud face, and the other I did. It was Grandad. The photograph was taken in the desert. Egypt, I guessed. And though the jar wasn't in the shot, like an invisible force, you could sense the damage was already at work. Professor Hanawati, for that was who the other man was, I was certain, looked angrily at the camera. Grandad stared at the ground. It was a shock to see them both as young, unhappy men, but it was nothing compared to what I saw next. When I'd first come into the room, the desk had blocked it. Now the hearthrug lay before me in all its gruesome glory. There was something on it, something dark and grey that looked like cinders from the fire. The once pretty carpet was now completely blackened, yet the armchair right next to it hadn't even been scorched. Come to think of it, the ashes weren't like ones from a fire. They were darker, heavier, with a smell like bad meat. I felt clammy and sicker than ever because I'd read the newspaper report, so I knew exactly what I was looking at. The article had described the hearthrug in horrid detail. This was the very room, the very spot that Professor Hanawati had burned to death. Someone had tried to clear away the mess. The one small mercy was that the feet had gone. But my brain still couldn't cope with what I was seeing. I didn't know if I was going to be sick or faint. I couldn't stay in this room any longer. As I turned to go, at the very last moment, I spotted the corner of a piece of bright blue paper sticking out from under the armchair. I hesitated. It was right next to the ashes. Holding my breath, I ducked down, grabbed it quick, and it was paper, more than one piece, with the title Lysandra, and completely untouched by the fire. I'd never been so glad to see anything in my life. Stuffing it down my coat, and before I breathed another breath, I ran for the door. Looking forward to seeing you soon. I hope you enjoyed. Night night.